So, it's pretty cool when you turn right to the page, right? I like it when that happens. All right, we have, you can open up your Bibles, 1 Kings chapter 18. Between COVID and missionary speaking, it's not often I go 3 Sundays before I preach again. So here I am again. We were in Elijah, or we were looking at the life of Elijah the last few weeks, and I've been enjoying it because I've never gone through the book of Elijah, and you've got, in this case, here's the danger you have with me today, is I had 2 weeks to prepare this sermon. So I actually had to, I reached the point actually where I had to just say, oh, that's so good, but I just got to leave it out. It just for the sake of people's sanity, got to leave that out there. But we've been looking at Elijah, and I always like to give a little recap on where we're at with him. Remember, at the time, he was a prophet who we hadn't heard of him, we hadn't seen him anything, so he was kind of a man out of nowhere, and it says where he's from, and such a small town, such a small village that even to this day, archaeologists have a hard time determining where that was. So he's a man out of nowhere, a nobody, who came from nowhere, and he stands in front of the king, the court of the king, and gives a prophecy from God to him, the greatest someone in Israel, the king. And the prophecy is what God, the greatest someone in the universe, is going to do. And in his case, God did nothing. God did nothing by causing it to not rain, not even dew on the ground. Elijah said, until I say so. God had given Elijah the authority for when it would be. We know from the Bible, and Jesus talking about the event later, that it was 3.5 years. We're going to see here today that by the 3-year point, or after the 3-year point, is when things are picking up again. And we're going to look at this story here starting in chapter 18, verse 1. Now, just as a reminder, Elijah, he gave the prophecy to the king. God said, I want you to go and hide. He went and hid in a ravine, and he was there for a while. And then from there, God said, here, I want you to go. I want you to stay with this widow in Zarephath. Zarephath is a community that was not in Israel. God sent him to the neighboring country to the north, and he stayed with a widow there. God did some incredible things there, but now, after a while, in fact, if you look back through chapter 17, there's a phrase that gets repeated a couple times. It says, after a while. After a while. And now we get to chapter 18, verse 1, after a long time. It says, after a long time, in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, this is just another name for that part of Israel at the time, was severe in Samaria. And Ahab had summoned Obadiah, his palace administrator. Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord. While Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each, and had supplied them with food and water. Ahab said to Obadiah, go through the land to all the springs and valleys. Maybe we can find some grass to keep the horses and mules alive so we will not have to kill any of our animals. Tells you how bad the drought's getting there. So they divided the land they were to cover, Ahab going in one direction and Obadiah in another. As Obadiah was walking along, Elijah met him. Obadiah recognized him and bowed down to the ground and said, is it really you, my lord Elijah? Yes, he said, go tell your master, Elijah is here. Ends up being, there's more story than what we have time to look at here today, but we're really, even though we've been looking at Elijah, today we're focusing on Obadiah. Because in the midst of all this focus on Elijah the prophet and God doing incredible miracles for him and through him, you forget that God was at work in other places and other people, and it's Obadiah. And one of the things you can see from Obadiah is, and it's a reminder to us, in the midst of really hard things, don't resign. Don't resign from what's going on. Don't resign from the situation that's happening there. You learn that from Obadiah. Once again, you see in the Bible, there's a godless leader, and yet somehow God has managed, even though there's godless leadership going on, God has managed to infiltrate and place in the administration of godless leadership his people to do his things and to work and to act in the midst of people being godless and saying, no, we're going to do things my way. We're going to do things I see best. I don't believe in God. I don't think God has the best, or religion has the best things in store for people. God puts his people in there, and God still gets his way and still has his things going on there. And you see all sorts of examples of this all throughout the Bible. You see that God placed Joseph in leadership in Egypt. You see here Obadiah with King Ahab. There's even one, this story isn't too well known. She's not called aunt, but she is. Aunt Jehoshaphat. She was the aunt of Joash. Joash was the youngest of several brothers. His father was Amaziah, and his father died. And so then Joash's grandmother seized power by killing all his brothers. And while this is going on, Aunt Jehoshaphat, if I'm saying her name correctly, she snatched Joash, who literally was just months old at the time, and hid him. Because every successive male in the family is the next to the throne. Grandma thought that she had killed them all off, and she was ruling Israel for about 7 years until Joash is 7 years old, and they bring him out and place him as king. He became king when he was 7 years old. God had placed his aunt there to spare his life and to continue on with the kings that God wanted. There's a nameless girl that you read about later on in Kings. We don't know her name. She was a little Jewish slave girl, but she's the one who was a slave girl to Naaman. Naaman, the enemy general to Israel, who developed leprosy. She's the one to say, there's a prophet in Israel. And she sent him there, and he ends up getting healed that way. You see, probably the biggest well-known example in the Old Testament is Daniel. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, 4 men who feared God and would not deviate from serving him in their lives or in their lifestyles whatsoever. And yet they ended up being some of the highest positioned people in the kingdom of Babylon in their day. And then even you can look in the New Testament, and Paul talks in the book of Philippians, he talks about all the believers in Caesar's household. See, God is always inserting his people in administrations and in kingdoms and the like. We watched, even in the last presidency, who we could see very plainly who some of the God's people were in the last administration. We saw Vice President Mike Pence. We saw Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, devout in his belief. We saw Ben Carson. Dr. Ben Carson, devout in his belief. We saw them plain as day. Now, you may look at the current administration and say, I don't know if I see them. You know what, though? Just because you can't see them, I'd say based on what we see with the Word of God and the track record God has, we may not see them, we may not know who they are, but God has his people placed very highly, strategically, all around this administration. God's always putting his people in those places. We have this thing that's been going on, not just in America, but you see it even all around the world, in all sorts of governments and other organizations and the like. When someone is part of a government, whether they're in the legislature or sometimes they might be on the board of an organization and the like, and something happens that is disagreeable to a whole large section of society, that there's an outcry about the decision and the direction and the actions that are going on by that organization or that government there, you'll see individuals who their form of protest against the action that's going on is they resign. Say, you know what, I am going to have nothing to do with this. I resign. And they step down and they leave. Like that. In fact, it's almost become a thing where it's almost left to be that's your only way to signify I don't want you to think I'm associated with them at all. I want you to know that I am so opposed to that. It's almost become that if you're in one of these leadership roles, that's the only action you have available to you. And here's Obadiah, who is the palace administrator. He is in a corrupt kingdom. He's got the queen, who she has determined that a valid way of dealing with people who are opposed to you and what you're doing is to kill them. And the crazy thing is that even though we read in the Bible, we read about kings and queens, and yes, on paper, it is a dictatorship when you're a king, even if you're a good king and a godly king. But if you really start reading the scriptures, one of the things you realize that even if you're a king, you still have to be aware of the way the political winds are blowing in your nation. And you have to be conscious of those things. And in light of that here, I can't help but think, here's Jezebel killing these prophets. It wasn't just Ahab and Jezebel who were godless. It was a big chunk of society that was. And so she starts killing God's prophets. And it almost seems to me that there was a big chunk of the nation that was saying, they were annoying me too. I'm glad they're gone. Now, it says that they were prophets. And I don't think that they were prophets quite like Elijah was, where he's got direct proclamations from God. I think that most of their ministry might have been more like preaching. And here's the thing, though. You can be a preacher of righteousness, and you can still be very irritating to people who are living unrighteous lives. And I think that their preaching was really irritating to Jezebel and many others who were living unrighteous lives. And so having them killed took away the irritation. So in the midst of all this going on, Obadiah, he's like, he could have said, you know what? I don't want to have anything to do with this. I'm a man of God. I serve the Lord. I have since I was a young person here. And I don't want to be associated with this. I quit. I resign. And he didn't do that. In fact, he thought just the opposite. He thought, you know what? I am going to somehow leverage my position for where I'm at and use it for God's kingdom. If he had never been the palace administrator, would he have had the resources available to him? It'd be one thing to take 100 prophets and hide them between two caves. It'd be another thing entirely in the midst of a crushing drought that was going on and famine. It'd be another thing to have the resources available to you to feed them, to water them. Probably because of his position, he had those resources available to him. And so Obadiah didn't resign. In the midst of so many situations that we are in, it can be so often they're like, you know what, I want to get out of this situation. I want to get away from this situation. I would encourage you to prayerfully consider, like Obadiah, that maybe I shouldn't resign. Maybe I should stay. Because there might be some moment. Here's the thing. We hear this one big thing that he did, the 100 prophets, hiding them, keeping them from being killed by Jezebel. But there had to be dozens and dozens of conversations with the king on just day-to-day business and operations of the country. How many times would a suggestion, would an insight, would a conversation with Obadiah have been one where Ahab had one train of thought going into the conversation, but after talking to Obadiah, he alters or sways or just slightly deviates from the plan he had to a different way because he had a conversation with Obadiah. You can't help but think that there was probably many, many things that ended up being different because Obadiah was there. He didn't resign. You never know when. You never know how. It doesn't all get recorded. It doesn't all, make the newspaper headlines on what happened and how you made a difference because you, the Christian, stayed there. But we should consider that there are situations that maybe you want out of, that maybe I want to distance myself, I don't want to be associated with that. Maybe there's times you say, you know what, I'm not quitting. Obadiah didn't. And boy, if there was ever a guy who had reason to, if ever there was a guy who you'd say, I don't blame you for wanting to quit, it would have been Obadiah. Years ago, we youth pastored in another part down in southern Illinois. See, you never know when these things might happen. And in this small town we were in, there's about 3 or 4 of us youth pastors who, it got started before I got there, but I got in on it too. The high school wanted volunteers to be lunchroom monitors during lunch. And so there's about 3 or 4 of us youth pastors. We did that. So we got to be around all the teenagers every day for 20 minutes or a half hour at lunch. And, and make relationships and just be there with the kids and the like. It was a great thing. But you never know what might happen. One day, one of the other youth pastors, he stayed after lunch and he was when I was in high school, we called it the teacher's lounge. like they were pouring drinks or something like that. I don't know. They weren't doing that. I do remember, it's such a different world. I do remember anytime you walked by the teacher's lounge like that, it'd just be a billow of cigarette smoke just rolling out of there, because cigarette smoking indoors wasn't a thing back then. But he stayed afterwards, and for whatever reason, he was in the teacher's room, the break room there, and as he was in the break room, there was just one other teacher in there, and that teacher got a phone call. This is before cell phones. Teacher got a phone call. It was his doctor. And he got the news. It's brain cancer. And that teacher, he just lost it. He just broke down. He's just sobbing. And there, in that moment, who could have predicted that time that he would have been there that day in that room? Just him and that teacher. There was a youth pastor. God had one of his people there in that moment, in that time. You never know when these things might happen. I remember hearing the story of a teenager in high school who her perseverance really paid off, because if you're going to choose to say, you know what, I'm not going to resign, I'm not going to quit, you got to have some perseverance in you, and we love stories of perseverance that we hear about, because perseverance is hard, perseverance is difficult. We all recognize that. We're inspired by stories of perseverance, we get emotional by those stories, we're motivated by them, again, because perseverance is hard. Well, that's why, anytime we hear the story, somebody's saying, I lost 100 pounds. Even if you've never been in a position where you had to do that in life, you are impressed because the way they got there was perseverance. They stuck it out there. Not everybody, here's the thing about perseverance too, not everybody does persevere, but we know that all can. That all can, especially with the Lord. 1 Corinthians 15:58 reminds us of this. It says, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. That's the perseverance. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. We got to keep that in mind, because so often we look to see results, to see things progressing, to see things changing. You may not always see that, and so you got to do your work in the Lord knowing that it's not in vain. In fact, I'll get to that verse here in a little bit, but I was mentioning there was a high school girl who years ago, her entire high school career, she was bullied. She was bullied because of her weight, bullied because of her looks, bullied because of her faith. It was an awful experience. There was many times, there was lots of tears for how she was treated all throughout high school. Then one day in her senior year of high school, they had the testing days, where the state has the school do the standardized testing. So there's no regular classes that day, but all the kids are meeting in class and they're being given these tests. They finished one of those tests early, the bell hadn't rung yet, but they couldn't just get up and leave the class. They had to stay in the classroom. But the teacher said, all right, well, we're all done early. You guys just, quietly talk amongst yourselves till the bell rings. So as the teacher says that, one girl turns to the bullied girl and says, that's their senior year, she goes, how is it that you're always smiling? And the bullied girl, it just came out of her. She said, it's because of Jesus. See, and everybody in that school knew how she'd been treated. They'd all witnessed it for 4 years. She says, it's because of Jesus. And she starts sharing her faith and her relationship with Jesus. In the matter of a few minutes, every kid in every desk just turned their desk and faced her. And for the remainder of that class hour, she told her entire class about Jesus. She persevered. She never quit. She could have so easily been one of those kids who, after a really bad day in her sophomore year, her junior year, come home and said, I can't go to school anymore. I can't take it. Homeschool me. Transfer me to another school. That's resigning. And she never quit. She never resigned from that. And because she persevered, there came a day where one day in a class, every other kid in the class turned their desk in her direction and let her talk about her faith, because she didn't quit. It's a reminder to us in these times that when we're in these situations, we shouldn't resign. If you're thinking of resigning, if you're thinking of quitting a situation, you're definitely in a tough spot. I don't want to downplay that. But I would strongly encourage you to prayerfully consider that maybe God might want to have you stay. Now that's between you and the Lord, but man, I would encourage you, Obadiah would encourage you, don't resign. Don't quit. You never know when the moment might come where the reason you're there comes out and you see, this is why I've been here. Persevere through it all. Here's another thing about this, is that the risk is worth the reward. That's what Obadiah would tell us here. If you're waiting to be rewarded in this life, though, you've got the wrong reward in mind. Obadiah took a huge risk by hiding those 100 prophets. He knew the moment he was scheming that, the moment he started that plan into action, he knew the incredible risk to his life. He knew what his fate was. He knew what his sentence would be if he was ever caught for doing that. And the thing is that God has in mind to reward his saints, and he has seen and kept a record of every one of our actions. For everything we do that God in his word has promised, I will reward you if you do that. God has kept a record of that. Just because you may not be aware of it, just because you haven't seen the sheet of paper where God is writing it down, God's kept a record of that in all that thing there. But God also knows, I want to reward you, and I have a good gift, a good reward in mind for you, but a good gift given at the wrong time is a wasted gift. So what God has in mind for rewarding us, for our perseverance, for our not quitting, is such a reward that even though in the midst of perseverance and trials, hey, I'd kind of like a reward here. That'd be kind of like, that'd really help me. It's like, oh, it was worth it all here. Obadiah lived his life like, you know what? I'm not concerned about being rewarded here. I know where my reward is going to be. I know when it's going to happen, because that's a great gift, and giving us God's great gift and God's great reward in heaven is so much better than if we were ever to receive it here. We watched just this week, Friday, graduation here in town. I've been watching on Facebook, lots of friends all over the country. It seems like the last 3 days are like high school graduation everywhere going on. And somewhere in some towns across America, there's always a few kids, high school graduation, they're getting a gift. They're getting a car. Not my kids, but someone's kids. Getting a car. That's a pretty good gift, pretty handy to get it. If I do that for my kids, it may not run, but but that's a pretty good gift. It sets you up. You're ready to head off to college. You've got transportation to school and to work and whatever may be there. That can be a good gift. But it's a gift that when you give it, it's important that you give it at the right time to give it. If you give it to a high school senior and they're getting it, that's a good time to give it. The other thing I've watched on Facebook this week is there's other graduations going on. Some friends of Susan and I watching their oldest son graduate preschool here. Now after he walked the aisle of graduating preschool, there was not his father there saying, here's the keys, son, and giving him a car at his preschool graduation. It's a great gift, but it's at the completely wrong time. And now it's not a gift, it's a weapon. When you got a preschooler who's behind the wheel of the car there. A good gift given at the wrong time ends up being a terrible gift. And pardon me. Here's Obadiah saying, you know what? The risk is worth the reward. And I'm not worried about getting my reward here. I know that God will see what I'm doing, and God will reward me. And he'll reward me in his good time with his good gift. The risk is worth the reward. In fact, we're reminded of this in Galatians 6:9. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Well, the proper time for some of our good works is going to be in heaven when we reap the reward. And that's okay, because if I'm getting a gift that cannot be contained down here, how great is that gift going to be? It'll be phenomenal. Now, here's the other thing in this story that we see, is that this story reminds us that God isn't just working in the background, God is working in the foreground. And even though we may not see all the occurrences and the place where God is working and moving, it's still in the foreground. If you really look at, starting in chapter 17 is where the story of Elijah begins. Now we're here on chapter 18. A lot has happened with Elijah. But if you really are honest with yourself as you read the story, except for Elijah standing in front of the king, everything else that happens for the next 3 years in his life is really in the background. It's really outside. First, he's in a ravine alone for months on end. It's just him and some ravens bringing him bread and meat morning and evening. That's it. He's in the background. And yet we're given that story right there. And because he's Elijah, we kind of maybe emotionally bring his story to the foreground. But he's not. He's in the background. God's working in Elijah's life and through Elijah's life, but he's doing it in the background. Even when he sends him out of the country, to the neighboring country, to that widow. I get the feeling also that she wasn't really advertising all that was going on in her home with him there. Says, because that's a story where she was down to her last flour, her last oil. And Elijah said, those aren't going to run out. Every time you go to pour flour out, there's flowers coming out. Every time you go to pour oil out of the jug, oil's going to be coming out until it rains again. She's literally having miracles every meal she makes. Her son got sick and died while Elijah was there. Elijah raised him from the dead. God raised him from the dead through Elijah. But all these things happening, as far as Israel's concerned, in the background. So now you fast forward to, or you come back to Israel, and really all the things that have been going on in Israel were things in the foreground. There was, everyone been wondering with Elijah, where is he? Is he even alive? Who might be helping him hide? We haven't seen him post on Twitter or Instagram anything for a while. He's gone off social media for us to know what he's up to and where he's at. But the truth of the matter is that God had put Elijah in the background, and all the other things that we saw, God was still working in the foreground. You see there in chapter 18, verse 4, while Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had hidden 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, or taken 50 in each. There that you see, this is what's going on in the foreground. Now granted, the hiding part, that's kind of a background thing, but the killing of prophets, that's a nationally known issue. That's a thing that's making the papers. That's going on there. So while Elijah's been off on his own personal retreat, we see that being a prophet in Israel had definitely become something that was extremely hazardous to your health there. And the queen had decided that to murder anybody who got in her way, she's doing that. And she's not hiding it. It's out in the open there. But while Jezebel is doing that, killing off these men of God, the people of Israel, they don't have a problem with it. They're okay with it. They're kind of throwing their hat in the ring. Yeah, that guy was annoying me too. But in all of that here, just because you don't see what God is doing doesn't mean that God is doing nothing. Just because you don't see what God is doing doesn't mean that God may even be working in the foreground and you don't even realize it. Let me give you an example from the New Testament. In fact, I just preached on it a few months ago. The story of Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was the short tax collector. Jesus came to Jericho, Zacchaeus had heard all about him, wanted to see him, and he's so short he can't see over the crowds. He runs down the street, sees a tree, grown man climbs a tree. Very against culture to do that, but that's how desperate he was to see Jesus. Him and Jesus never met. As Jesus gets down the street that far, gets even with the tree, he looks up and he calls him by name. He's Jesus. He already knows his name. Zacchaeus, come down. I'm having lunch at your place today. Didn't even invite himself. Just kind of told him, by the way, you're feeding me lunch today. And Zacchaeus, this is great. But here's the thing. If you pause and think about it for a moment, here's the thing where God had been working in the foreground, preparing that story, preparing that moment, probably for decades, right in front of everyone. And this is how. When that tree got planted. When that tree got planted, and I don't think back then they had the conservation programs like we have today. I think just somehow a seed fell there. A seed took root there. A root grew into a sapling, grew into that tree that was there that day. That years earlier, maybe even decades earlier, God planted a tree, knowing that there would be a day somewhere in the near future where that tree would be big enough, tall enough, strong enough to hold a grown man to climb it who would want to see the Son of God. That God didn't have some prophet place a sign in front of the tree when it was small, little, don't hurt this tree. Someday the Son of God is going to introduce himself to a short tax collector, and it's going to be a really big moment, so leave this tree alone. No sign was put there. No pronouncement was made. But God had been working in the foreground. How many hundreds of people, thousands of people had walked by that tree over the years? How many other children had climbed that tree? It's a sycamore fig tree. It's making fruit. How many people had enjoyed the fruit off of that tree for years and years? All right there in front of them. And yet God chose the time when that seed would be planted and that tree would grow. God was working in the foreground because he knew there's coming a day. This tree is important, not just for its fruit, because there's going to be a day where a man meets the Son of God because he's climbed this tree right here. I need to give that man a high place where he can climb and see the Son of God so that moment can happen. See, God's working in the foreground. We don't always see it. God doesn't always announce it. He has some things he announces very big when they happen. But many other things he just does. And they're going on. Just because there hasn't been an announcement about it doesn't mean that God hasn't been working. He's working in the foreground with all that. There. You've heard many times me tell you the story, I go through Bible college. Every year I showed up, every semester I showed up. I never had enough money to pay for the entire semester when I showed up. I just went on faith. I had one semester where I'd earned enough money working in Alaska that I could pay for the whole semester outright. So my first 3 years, 6 semesters, 5 of the 6 were all on faith. God provided. I come back for my senior year, and I got some money, and it's just like the other times. Well, God's going to provide. I put some money down, and within about 3 weeks, I realized, he's not doing it this time. He's not providing. And as soon as you drop down in classes, the way it was, I knew I'm coming back a 5th year. And somewhere in that, in my years at Trinity, I had some friends that were a few years ahead of me. And they were very good as evangelists and also in singing and in drama. And they formed a ministry team on their own. And once they graduated, they were a year or two ahead of me, they went out and they were touring the whole country doing their ministry. Somewhere in my 4th year, where I was dropped down in credits and I was relegated to having to come back another year to finish out my degree, somewhere in my 4th year, that drama team was at a youth rally in Southern Illinois. And in that youth rally, there was a teenage girl there who met him and talked to him and got to know about Trinity Bible College and decided, I want to go there. And she came there my 5th year. Isn't that a nice story, Susan? Yeah. In the midst of, now, all that going on was the background to me, but it was the foreground to everybody else. That God was working and that God was moving. Well, I'm going to have you hold on here, Alan, because I got somebody I want you to meet. I got a plan for you here. That God is working. Even if we don't always see him working, he's working. Now remember, a lot of times he isn't announcing what he's up to, but he's doing it. And there's other things he announces in great ways. The greatest announcement that's ever going to happen is this: for the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. You think about that for a moment. The day Jesus comes back, it's not just that everyone will see him come in the clouds, which they will, but it's that God is going to give the volume of the voice of the archangel so loud, every ear in the world will hear him shout, he's here. He's here. So some things God announces as big as they can be announced. And other things God doesn't announce at all. But either way, God is working. Either way, he is working in our lives and he is working his plan. So in the midst of wondering, should I resign? Should I just cut and run on this? Don't resign. Hang in there. You don't know when. You don't know how God's gonna use you. And remember, the risk is worth the reward. And what's the reward we're waiting for? We're waiting for the best reward possible, a reward that's so great, it would be spoiled to be given the reward here. It'd be ruined to give the reward here. In the midst of all that, we also remember that, you know what, God is always working. Just because we don't see it, just because we don't recognize it. Whoever, How many times was a parent holding their little child by the hand, walk by that sycamore fig tree when it was just little? And there had to be a moment or two where some kid said, "Mommy, Daddy, what kind of tree is that?" There was no parent that said, "Well, that's a tree that someday someone's going to meet the Son of God because they're stood in this tree." No one said that. But just because they didn't know didn't mean that God wasn't working, that God wasn't moving. He's always working in our lives, in places. Just because you don't know it, you know what? You can trust it. You can trust it that he's doing that. So let's bow our heads. Heavenly Father, thank you for men like Obadiah in the midst of the great prophet Elijah doing so many incredible things, and your people being so amazed at his ministry. You also had an Obadiah. And Lord, we can learn from his life some inspiring, some great things. Father, may we have perseverance. Perseverance to stay the course in the midst of times where maybe it doesn't feel like it's worth it. May we keep going with that. Lord, thank you that you see what we do and you have a reward for us. And Lord, we will hold on to the faith. Even though we may not see it, you are working. You might even be working right in front of us and we just don't recognize it right now. But there'll be some day where all of a sudden our eyes will get big and go, "Oh." And we'll see that you were preparing that right in front of us all along. Lord, so we will live by faith. You are working, even though we may not see it. Will you take just a moment, right where you're at? This is the moment. Just take time. Holy Spirit, what have you been saying to me today? Will you just take a moment and have your own conversation with God right now? Go ahead.